Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today we're going to be talking about common activatable widgets versus common user widgets. What's the difference and when you should use which? To sort of dive into this, we kind of have to talk about CommonUI in general. And really the big thing you need to know is CommonUI, the idea is that it is a plugin that is built into Unreal Engine. The idea is it allows you to have input routing done in such a way that it can handle gamepad, keyboard, and mouse. It just basically handles input in a slightly different way than the default setup does. And so with that, when you're creating widgets, you have to consider, is this a widget that the user needs to interact with? And that's going to be your biggest determining factor into which one you use. So if we go in here and we take a look at our two options here, the big thing you're going to notice is that a common user widget is the parent class, and a common activated widget takes that and extends it, as you can see as it's underneath that class down here. So what's the big difference? So a common user widget is designed to be sort of like your default widget. It doesn't do necessarily a whole lot, it doesn't have a whole lot of functionality. It's meant to just be sort of a base. Now with that, it does still handle a lot of CommonUI input things, but it doesn't do it by default in terms of this isn't something you would set up to be shown on screen as an active widget you can interact with. This is meant to be a base layer that then maybe you put multiple activatable widgets on top of. Versus an activatable widget comes with functionality like back handling, activating versus deactivating, and it basically handles a lot of what people think of when they think of widgets, right? Input handling and things like that. And so the big difference comes in when you're creating your widgets. You need to think about, is it something that's going to live within another widget, or is this something that is going to be actively handling input? And that'll be sort of your determining factor. For example, I have some UI here I can show you. For example, my missile builder here. This is a common activatable widget because I've got things I want my players interacting with. They can touch different buttons, they can do different things. But within here, I have a different widget called a missile display. And this one is set up sort of as a default, as a common activatable widget, so that I can actually move my cursor into here and select these items. But let's say instead, this is just a display and maybe they only interact with these drop downs. I could then make that a common user widget, something that doesn't necessarily need to handle that input. As you can see here, with things that do handle input, though, you'll get a lot of these options. For example, back handler, is that back action displayed in the action bar? Maybe you don't need all of these, depending on what you're actually doing. But the idea is you basically want to focus in on what you are using it for, and whether or not you need it to handle input. If it doesn't ever need to handle input, you can basically just leave it to be a very plain common user widget, and it kind of simplifies things both for you and for the system, because then you just don't have all these extra options that you don't need. And yeah, so let's open up a different example here. So as you can see here, this common user widget I have, this is just an FPS and frame time display that I show in my settings. Players don't ever need to interact with this. This does have some updates and things that it does, but just off the hop, there's not a whole lot that is happening in here in this item. And so because of that, it's a common user widget. It handles all of its own things here. Players don't ever interact with it. No input comes in. And so when I actually add this to my display in my settings, as you can see here, I have it up in the upper right hand corner. There's not a whole lot going on. It lives in here, and when this widget gets activated, it gets activated. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot going on. So let's actually talk about the activation versus deactivation. So with common activatable widgets, there's a little bit of logic that goes on the back end. Construct and destruct aren't necessarily going to make your widget show. It's whether or not they're activated or deactivated. So what happens is when you are creating your widget and it goes onto the stack, if it is set to auto activate by default, it will then show up on the stack. But let's say you have a modal that you want to put on the stack but not yet activate. You would turn off auto activate, you put it on the stack and create it, get it ready to go, and then the moment you're ready to show it, you then would activate that widget, and that would make it show up, and it's already been constructed. So all the construct functions ran in the background. It's just ready to go. And that's not something that normally UMG UI actually does. Normally, when it is constructed, it's just there, it's ready to go, it's already activated. That is the big difference with common activatable widgets and common user widgets versus your default UMG ones. Is that the input handling, because we want to have back handlers so we can go back to previous widgets, is handled more of like a stack or a queue depending on what actual version you use. For example, in my menu system, I generally use stacks myself. If I go ahead and open up my main menu stack here, and so I've got a menu stack and a modal stack, and basically they're almost identical, except the modal stack is all anchored to the center, versus the menu stack is anchored to every corner. And that's because my menus, I generally want to take up the full screen, versus modals, maybe I only want to show a small little bit here in the middle, just like a pop-up confirming things. And so with these, when you activate a widget, depending on how you are doing it, you can push them and not activate them, or you can set them to be active, just depending on what exactly you're doing with them. In fact, you can deactivate them, and that's what back handlers do by default. When you are going through here and you're deactivating widgets with that back handler, all that does is it just deactivates it by default. But yeah, so you can throw in a little bit of logic in that back handler so that you can do things like a confirmation modal or something like that, just to add a little bit of user experience design into that sort of discussion. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. If you have any questions, leave them down below. But otherwise, good luck and good hunting.